Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, Sanctuary of Ice, Labyrinth of Lanes. Labyrinth of Lanes was a covenant removed from the Sanctuary of Ice supplement because it displayed too few elements unique to the Hermetic Alps. It was, therefore, the easiest to remove, and that makes it the easiest to add to other tribunals. The text was saved on one of my earlier websites. I'm going to repeat it in this podcast and inculcate little comments. This small covenant is officially in an extinguished Roman salt mine near Salzburg, but the site is linked to a basement in Vienna by the smallest hermetic portal in the order. Only 2.5 feet high and a little over 2 feet wide, this portal has been constructed in miniature so that only animals can use it. Labyrinth of Lanes is an unusual Bajorna covenant. Originally, this covenant belonged to House Yarburton, but during one of their introspective phases, many members left to larger covenants, and its membership was open to other houses. A free-thinking Bajorna with notions of adapting to urban life, considered somewhat mad by his own house, was one of the recruits. As ordered by his primus, when the schismatic hostilities became overt, he retreated to Crintera and, in his absence, raiders from the Rhineland slaughtered his Sodales. Eventually he returned, laid his comrades to rest, and founded a line of Bajornas interested in living as feral animals in urban environments. Members of his house still think of these Bajornas as little touched, but appreciate that Labyrinth of Lanes gives them somewhere safe to stash eccentric relatives. I'd just like to note that the idea of including this in Sanctuary of Ice was to show you an alternative way of playing Bajornas. A minimalist covenant, like many of the earliest Bajorna structures, Labyrinth is a series of tunnels extending from an old mine shaft. Although extended, reinforced, and beautified over the years, the tunnel complex is far from voluminous. The Covenant's Aegeus extends over a huge area, more than a mile in diameter, because the Bajornas don't want to pinpoint the location of the otherwise disguised Covenant. Within the Covenant's huge, theoretical borders live a few families of foresters and farmers who are whisked to the Covenant when cleaning needs done. Back when Sanctuary was published, the idea that you could hide a Covenant in this way was somewhat newish. People were used to Covenants which were essentially castles. The exception, of course, was Calbaeus, but they claimed sovereignty over the land around them. At least they had a broken royal crown as their symbol, so you can't imagine they were particularly secretive about their general location. Moving on. Customs. This covenant's chief custom is absence. Magi reside here while studying, but far prefer to live and socialize in Vienna. Although the Covenant is never absolutely unstaffed, visiting redcaps often find only a single magus in residence. Sometimes Yarburton Magi visit Labyrinth to consult the library, or because they see it as a model for how all Magi might live in some distant future. If trusted, these Magi are given remarkably free access to the Covenant's areas, and some are, for brief periods, left to guard things while the Bajorna are away. Just as a note, this was your invitation as a non-Bajorna to turn up and participate in adventures at the site. Also, the idea that one day Magi may all hide out and gate into civilized areas is a remnant of the idea in earlier editions that magic was dying out. Back to the text. This highlights the second custom of the Covenant, disposability. The Bajorna progenitor of this tradition survived because he was willing to give up all his material possessions and flee to Crintera. This lesson has not been lost on the current members. Each is ready to hide for years if necessary in animal shape and travels slowly toward a safe site. Useful items have been cached, mainly in Vienna, but also in other locales for emergencies. Although attached to their laboratory site, the Bajorna are willing to abandon it if faced with overwhelming force. Raiding is less tempting than it might at first appear. Seasoned Bajorna are excellent guerrilla fighters who, if forced to retreat, would seek first reinforcements, then revenge. Those members of House Bajorna who are strongly influenced by pack mentality heart shapes, or who retain compassion, have a soft spot for members of this covenant, since it's seen as a sort of rest home for the philosophically challenged. Such Bajornas might aid their less than sane cousins, or seek recompense for their suffering. I'd just like to flag that at this stage, elderly Bajorna just became magical animals. They didn't become kaiju until later works. Labyrinth is a winter covenant because it has few resources, little desire to expand them, and its magi are prepared to abandon their site. Technically, its members are insane because neither of the social systems to which they adhere, the philosophy of Bajorna or the Hermetic Code, suggest that being curled up on the lap of an old woman knitting by the fire is a constructive use of time. Legally, it's unlikely to be extinguished because, in the absence of any other claimant, the Charter of the Labyrinth of Lanes gives the Primus of Yarberton the right to appoint a fresh council who would continue the covenant. A later amendment allows the Primus of Bajorna to veto any appointment made under these circumstances. And that was your second invitation to join the side. Magi. Sigismondo, follower of Bajorna. I'd just like to note that names were weirder earlier in the editions. Sigismondo means defender, but that's probably coincidence. The Covenant's leader, such as it has, Sigismondo's heartbeast is feline. He is technically an Egyptian wildcat. Like most European cats at this time, he's a mackerel tabby. He dislikes churchmen, since they have a habit of incinerating black cats at St. John's Day. He has mastered a simple spell which alters his coat colour, and, just for the priests, one of his defensive colorations is purely white with a gold cross on the chest. Just as a quick note, cats look different in the Middle Ages. Blotchy tabbies, the tabbies we have now, are an effect of urbanisation. Widespread cat murder, by the way, dates from slightly later than 1187 or 1220, depending on which edition you're setting your game in, but research was not as good at that time. Back to the text. Sigismondo has adopted a human family which he has been tending for almost a century. Gifted children are remarkably common in its many branches, and he has trained several apprentices while in cat shape. They have entered House Bajorna when they have an active heart shape, or House Yarberton if he could not draw a new shape forth. A few Bajorna train apprentices in this way. These new magi have the stingy master and isolated from the order floors. Tekka, Filia John, follower of Bajorna. I'd just like to flag that most of these characters have never turned up in any other book. Tekka is a Hungarian name. It means reaper, and I presume that was deliberate. A young hawk, Tekka has noticed that large cities are filled with pigeons. Why not, then, live in the city? The least dedicated to the Covenant's project of domesticating humans, Tekka is snappish and territorial. She's skilled at air magic and has several violent spells mastered so that she can cast them just as easily in her animal form. As with many Bajorna birds, her favoured tactic in hermetic combat is to flee to a range beyond human sight but within raptor sight. This gives her the advantage of unreturnable fire. I'd just like to note that that was cutting-edge stuff back 20 years ago. Brett Filius John, follower of Bajorna. Brett's name means Breton or Celt, and I assume that that's random. Brett is a young stallion who spends most of his time on the stud of a local nobleman. Let's not dwell on what he does there. Apples are apparently involved. Many magi are aware of his activities because horses which do not throw magi are uncommon, valuable, and available from that stud. Brett claims to have gone on crusade and witnessed various battles from beneath the buttocks of influential noblemen. He spends little time in Vienna proper and spends most of his time at the salt mine. Just as a note, it seems sad to me in retrospect that it was more comfortable for me to put a bestialist into this book than forcefully noting that the lesbian couple are actually lesbians. Damelon didn't direct me to do that. However, I'd had an experience where I was writing some fan material for Pendragon, and I tried standing up Duke Galhot as being in love with Lancelot, and if you read the books, he is clearly in love with Lancelot. I'm not saying that their relationship is physical, but Galhot receives a prophecy that says he will die unless he keeps Lancelot with him, and he forces Lancelot to leave for the love of him. He's clearly enraptured with Lancelot. The two of them do romantic things all the time. And when I tried to put that into some Pendragon notes, I was told, no, you can't have homosexuals in Pendragon, which is very strange because if you read the original source documents, I want to say Nennius, History of the Kings of Britain, anyway. One of the kings that follows Arthur, King Malgo, his entire court are gay. All of the noble women leave the country in despair for ever finding husbands because the entire membership of his guard, who are presumably still a round table, are homosexuals. And having had that experience, I think I toned down the whole homosexual angle in Sanctuary of Ice. Not so in later works. For example, House Tremare, doing the right things for the wrong reasons since the 9th century, tends to prefer to hire homosexual people because they're treated badly by the rest of the world and therefore they're particularly loyal. Moving on. Antoine Filia Sylvester, follower of Bajorna. I'd just like to note that that's a male name and I got that wrong. The fairy cat lineage I'm about to mention was later again used in Realms of Power magic. An enormous black cat of indeterminate age, Antoine is rumoured to be Sigmondo's daughter. He candidly admits that he has no idea if she is or not, but doubts it somehow. She's touched by the fairy, and may be related to the Irish king of cats, huge black prowlers that can carry a man in their jaws. Her heartbeast is essentially a huge panther. She may have the power to cause pneumonia, or to enhance the allergic reactions of cats in sufferers. Antoine is the most likely Covenant member to prowl the woods about the mine seeking little sprites to breakfast upon. She enjoys Vienna because it has cream in it. Hermetic magi speculate whether the irregular mutilations of livestock that occur in this tribunal are due to fairies or Antoine. That last sentence is what we used to call a plot hook back in the day. Things are rather more obvious in the modern day. Amélie Filia Elma, follower of Bajorna. This is based on the French film Amélie, and it's a bit rapey in hindsight. You may wish to skip this paragraph if you're sensitive to that kind of thing. Consider this a trigger warning. It also includes heart shapes, and heart shapes are no longer a thing. One of the rare heart shapers, Amélie becomes a warm breeze that whips through an area. She enjoys Vienna because, unlike a forest, it's full of humans, with which she makes sensual, intimate contact in her airy form. She's an attention seeker and picks pockets, steals hats, and snatches scarves, tumbling a mortal's possessions along the street in a childish game of catch me if you can. She looks around 30, but has looked that way for about 60 years. Looking at her again, it looks like this character is a rejigging of one of my earliest Bajorna makers. Her name was Smoke, and I wrote her after listening to a song, Smoke, by Natalie Imbruglia. She also was a heart shaper who had similar characteristics, except that she had the form of a roomful of smoke. Clotilda Filia Vanavar, follower of Bajorna. The spelling of that name should probably be Clothilde, and I presume she was influenced by the X-Man Maggot or by Bagamon from Wildcards. I can't recall. Also, looking at the name of her filius, Vanavar, I imagine that's Vannevar Bush, who was a futurist who wrote in, as I recall, the 1940s about some things which were of particular interest to librarians like myself. For example, he's one of the first people to describe hypertext. Although his is analog hypertext, I attempted to get analog hypertext into this book and was told I couldn't have it. He also described something which he called a cyclops, which, if you look up, is very similar to Google Glass. Again, that's something I tried to sneak into this supplement later in the Valnastium section, and again, it was cut out because it wasn't very well realised. But back to Clotilda. A maga of middle age, Clotilde has a subtle but potent ability. Because of her twilight experience, she can command all the rats in the city where she resides. With the assistance of her magic, she can see through their eyes, hear what they hear, and use them to carry waiting spells. Although she prefers her human shape, she needs no grogs while in Vienna, since a swarm of filthy rats follows her movements in the city's sewers, waiting for her command to surge toward the light of the flesh of her enemies. Actually, now that I think about it, it could just be the Pied Piper of Hamelin. It's sounding very dishonoured, but it was about 20 years before then, sir. Clotilda's heart shape is a mystery. It may be a rat, but rumours in the tribunal indicate it's a vast leech or bloodworm. An intriguing alternative is that the swarm of rats who follow her are made from her internal organs. Clotilde has been observed shifting into a variety of shapes, but this may be through silent, gestureless spellcasting. Coven folk. The Magi here simply don't see the point in having common folk except to tidy up a bit. There are humans who perform services for the Magi in Vienna, but most of these are simple tradesmen, whom include the Magi in their clientele. Grogs seem a bit superfluous to the Magi here, who can either shift into combat-worthy heart-shapes, or who can flee at high speed. Grogs need to be fed and housed, and then the buildings for that need to be defended, and it all seems too much to bother with. The Covenant has magical defences, which Redcaps have been assured are more than sufficient to deal with an army of small or moderate size, but whose precise nature have been left undisclosed. There are currently no distorted Coven folk at Labyrinth. The distortion recorded in the Yarberton era was related to saline magic. Certain servants gained a limited form of the magic resistance virtue, which protected them from demon-inspired illness, minor curses, befuddling fae, and similarly themed hermetic spells. Several salt-distorted Coven folk are interned in the Covenant's depths, their bodies incorrupt. The Bajorna are aware that such corpses could be mistaken for vampires or saints, and so cautiously prevent new distortions. Insert salt magic. Salt has powerful anti-magical properties. In certain areas, a sprinkle of salt is sufficient to dispel even powerful illusions. Minor demons can find salt irritating, and diseased spirits can be kept out of meat or forced from the body by its application. Although the current inhabitants of the Labyrinth aren't all that interested in the magical applications of salt, the Yarberton precursors studied the matter at length, and their findings have been retained in the Labyrinth's library. They don't take a lot of care of their books, but another advantage of living in a salt mine is that the air in the library is extremely dry and almost sterile, which has helped to preserve their collection. Boons and hooks. For the current edition of Ars Magica, the Covenant statistics would depend on what resources the player characters have access to, so any given Covenant can have several sets of statistics based on individual sagas. I'd suggest the following boons and hooks: Autocephalus, Aura, Council, Difficult Access, Felicitous Tribunal, Hidden Ways, House Covenant, Mystical Portal, and Peasants. If you are looking to play in this setting, I'd strongly recommend you go online and look at some of the salt mines and salt palaces. Salt is easy to mine, and so long as the area doesn't get wet, it retains its shape for generations. So there are vast cathedrals, modern hotel complexes, which have been gouged out of the side of old salt mines. They're truly extraordinary work, and they can give you some inspiration for what House Yarberton may have been thinking of doing when they originally set up this Covenant.